Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our November 26th Sappy Hour. My name is Sarah Rupert. I'm really happy to be back with you all again. It's been a little bit of almost a year since I've been here last, so I'm happy to be back. Uh, Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, composed of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Specifically, this is the home of Caldwell First Nation and part of the House of Walpole Island First Nation. We acknowledge the caregivers of this land and all the moccasins that have traveled it over time. I'm really looking forward to the presentations this evening. We're going to learn all about some of the northern trips that happened. And we have Kaylin here with us. Hi, Kaylin. And as always, Mike Burrell is with us as well. And Mike I'm going to pass it over to you. He's going to give you a brief intro about Northern tripping. And then we get to hear all about it from some people who did some Northern trips. And we'll have time for questions at the end and announcements. So I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. Welcome everybody. We've got three guest presentations here tonight. One of them looks like we're going to have a tag team maybe doing it. So I'm going to introduce those folks as we get to them. First up, we're going to have Ian Cook, and then we're going to head over to Sarah Gates, and then Andrew Keaveney and Michelle Locke, our third set of presenters. I'm going to just give a quick presentation about what the Northern trips are all about, and then you get to hear more from people who've actually done these fun trips. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Where'd my Zoom go? There we go. Share screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. You didn't have to enable that, Kaylin.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Should be good now.
Perfect. All right. All good? Everybody can see that?
Looks good.
Excellent. Okay, so Northern trips. All right, let's just get right into it. So when we're talking about Northern trips, we're doing these trips because we have coverage goals related to the Atlas. So on the left of your screen, you're seeing a map of the province that's divided into our Atlas blocks. Those are the 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer blocks. And then those are further divided into our Atlas squares, the 10K by 10K squares. And that's the basis with which we measure our coverage. So we have a sliding scale of how much effort we want to get completed in our squares. So when we talk about a complete square, we're talking about that adequate coverage. So 20 hours during the peak season, which in Northern Ontario is June 1st to July 10th. Starts a little earlier in late May in the south. We want to get 20 hours, and we want to complete 25-point counts. So we've shaded the province there according to our coverage goals. So in the middle band of the central portion, the sort of middle shade of green, we want to complete 5% of squares. And we want to do that at a block level. So out of 100 squares in a block, we want to complete 5 squares. And further north in the lightest green, we want to complete 2%. So 2 squares out of every 100 squares in a block. In Southern Ontario, our goal is 100%, but we're focusing on the 2 northern portions of the province for today. It's a pretty ambitious thing to get that coverage spread out across the north, especially when you get into places where you can't drive a car. So that's where these northern trips come in. And we have these trips kind of divided into northern trips and central trips. We're going to focus on the northern trips for this presentation, but I did want to mention that we do have these central Ontario trips as well. So I've got a slide coming up about them. We do about 5 to 10 northern trips. The Atlas supports about 5 to 10 northern trips a year. These are into the most remote parts of Ontario, which require flying in an airplane. I don't think we've done any helicopter trips, but that's a possibility. And these are really a unique opportunity to get to a place you may never get a chance to go again. These are almost always at least 2 weeks long, and that's on top of the travel time to get to the starting point. And we're very lucky we're able to subsidize the cost of these because they're very expensive when you factor in charter planes and things like that. Some of them are more than $20,000 when all is said and done. The Central Ontario trips, there's more opportunities. There's many places that we have these planned trips. They're into less remote parts of Ontario, places where you could drive to and then jump in a canoe kind of thing. This is really an opportunity for you to target Atlas gaps as part of whatever you might be planning in terms of your summer camping experiences. And a lot of these are in the 5 to 7 days range, and they're pretty inexpensive. Really, the biggest expense is getting to these spots with the cost of fuel these days. So just a little more about the Central Ontario canoeing and backpacking trips. These are available on the Atlas website. Maybe, Kaylin, if you can pop that into the chat and on Facebook when you get a chance, that'd be great. We haven't updated it yet for our 2025, but most of these trips are still available. So we'll be updating it soon. For these, if you're interested, have a look at the itineraries and then contact the appropriate regional coordinator to let them know you're interested, and they'll block that off for you. This requires you to do independent atlasing while you're camping. We have a little bit of ways we can support you, but not as much as far as the financial support as we do the real northern trips. So the northern trips, we've got about 10 or so that we have planned itineraries for this year. These are places that we have blocks that we have not got that 2% coverage yet. And so a lot of the trips that we have planned right now are into lakes. Some of them are onto rivers, flying in and then canoeing downriver and then getting picked up, or flying into a community and either atlasing a large lake by canoe or boat. So if you want to look at the trips that are up for interest, head to our Northern Trips webpage. Again, we'll try to get that into the chat. And make sure you fill out the application form. We're going to be trying to put the teams together for those trips sometime in January. So get your name in so we know you're interested as soon as possible, so we can start planning those pretty exciting adventures. So what's covered on these northern trips by the Atlas partnership? So the Atlas office is going to do the overall logistics, figure out the flights and things like that, what you need to cover as part of the trip. We cover the cost of the flights from the designating starting point. So a lot of the starting points are somewhere in Northern Ontario. Like we had a bunch of trips leave from Hearst last year. I think we were planning a bunch leaving from Pickle Lake this year, that sort of thing. So you need to get yourself there. If guides are a necessary part of the trip, that is usually covered by the Atlas. And then if canoe rentals are needed or boat rentals are needed, we try to cover that. And we also, for some of the trips, I think you'll see them in Ian's presentation, the pack canoes, the packable canoes. So we have a small fleet of those that we use in some trips that we are able to send on commercial flights. We have a Garmin InReach unit that we're able to lend out to teams so they can do their safety checks and stay in contact with their people at home. And then we have a small trip stipend that we use to help offset the cost of things like fuel and getting up there and the cost of gas, things like that. And then any atlasing equipment like Zoom handheld recorders. Some of the trips take the automated recording units, things like that. As far as what's required by atlasers themselves, it's up to them to plan their sort of day-to-day logistics, when they're going to pick up camp, when they're going to move, how they're going to get the actual survey coverage that we need to get done. They need to get that sorted out themselves. Obviously, they can ask the Atlas office for tips and things like that. They're required to get to and from the starting point. And then their camping gear and food, things like that, are required by atlasers. So that's the super quick overview. I want to save as much time as possible for presenters, so I'm going to do that now. And we'll have time at the end for questions. So first up is Ian Cook. Ian has done a couple Atlas Northern trips, and you're going to talk about the Fawn Severn trip. So take it away, Ian.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Yes, I'm Ian Cook, and I've done last year I did in the 23, I did the Fawn Severn trip, and the year before that, I did a river called the Mississa, sort of in the middle of that most northern stretch. So both of these trips represent the far north trips that Mike was talking about, well over 2 weeks. June 23rd to July 11th was our Severn trip, and that was the time, actually atlasing. I'll get into getting up there a little bit later. I've also done 2 trips for the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas and 2 trips for the Saskatchewan, very remote trips in those northern provinces. So some of the tips and advice I'm going to give you here is based on those 6 trips. Okay. Apologies for this lousy map, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the process of just getting to the start of this trip. The squiggly red line below, this is a map of Northern Ontario. You hopefully can be able to tell. Yeah, and that squiggly line is us driving past. We actually stopped in Wawa for the first night, drove to Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is a bit of it's a trick because you think you're almost there and then you have another 5 hours to go to get to Sioux Lookout. Then we had to stay overnight in Sioux Lookout because we were catching a flight the next day, a commercial flight, Wasaya Airlines to Sandy Lake. Sandy Lake, we had to stay. I'll get into that again. We were hoping just overnight. It ended up being a little longer. And then we flew Sandy Air to the start of our trip right there. Okay, next. That's just Google Maps. You can see Fort Severn up at the very top. That's where we ended. And you can follow the Severn River back. And then right there, stop there, Mike, goes south. That's the Fawn River. Yes. And then keep going. We started right about there, I'd say, on the Fawn River and headed down the Fawn, joined up with the Severn, and ended up at Fort Severn. Okay. So this trip was completed by Mike Ferguson, myself, Stefan Menu, and Alex Mills. Mike and I have done all of those 6 trips I talked about. Alex has done most of them, and Stefan has done 2 with us, and he's done a couple of others as well. Okay. So that's the gear that we had at the airport in Sioux Lookout, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about planning. The start of one of these trips starts weeks before you actually leave for the Northern Ontario. Part of it is a regular planning of a long, remote, inaccessible canoe trip, mostly food and gear. It's always tricky when there's 4 of you from 4 different places. None of us, live. It's not like a couple, so you don't want to bring 4 um, stoves or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of hundreds of emails back and forth. Likewise, food, divvying up the food. A real game changer we found was 2 of us had dehydrators, and I tell you that really changes things when you can dehydrate your own food. It's so much better than what you can buy commercially and so much easier. And for a long trip like this, it's almost essential to have dehydrated or freeze-dried food. So that's the regular planning for any trip. But then we also spent, considerable time before we even left strategizing for actually doing the atlasing, taking a careful look at the maps, determining where the priority squares were, where the other squares were, where we would try to get every day, even to the point of how we would try to access the priority square points, and really trying to get as much of that planned ahead of time. The more you do that ahead of time, the better you're going to be. Okay, next. So this is our home away from home in Sandy Lake. We were hoping to spend just a night there, but it ended up being a few nights because of a variety of problems. But that's the Sandy Lake Motel. I think it's a 1-star. Next. And this is the fleet of Sandy Air. And this is a good time for me to talk a little bit about logistics. Uh, the logistics for a trip like this are mind-boggling, and the Breeding Bird Atlas, Mike and his staff, does an amazing job. But I will tell all of you who plan on doing a trip is to be prepared for any type of delay conceivable, and you have to stay flexible and resourceful. What happened here was that this plane was way smaller than we realized it was going to be. It took actually 3 trips. And you saw on that line how far that flight was. 3 trips. And that took over 2 days just to do those 3 trips. Unfortunately, after the second trip, they also had mechanical problems. So we were delayed again for that. So I think we were at least 3, maybe even 4 days. This Sandy Air was also flying another group up into the Severn watershed. So they were also delayed because it took them 3 trips. So we were at least 3, maybe 4 days delayed, which really caused us a lot of stress at the beginning of the trip. But my point is you have to remain flexible and resourceful. The people who live up there are incredibly resourceful and will do anything they can to make things work. And it's quite remarkable what they do. And thank goodness for InReach devices now. That was our only communication, and it was brief texts. And therefore, when they said there was a mechanical problem and there'd be a delay, that was really about all we knew. Next slide. So this was our pilot, and this is him landing. Again, talk about logistics and resourcefulness. He had no idea where it might be safe to land on the Fawn. It's a very, very small river. You can see how wide it is there. And there really was probably one spot on that entire river where it was safe to land. Somebody he knew made a call to another one of the First Nations up there, and that First Nations knew of somebody who had a hunt camp and said, the river in front of it's probably okay to land. And that's what he did. And you can see we really are all about safety first, the gas can and the cigarette there. And that's pretty much how things work up there. Next slide. Because of we were dumped off ourselves, and our canoes and our tents were dumped off, but then we got the mechanical problems, and what we hadn't had delivered to us was our food. So we went one full day with very little food. Fortunately, our first camp was at this hunt camp, and there was some fishing tackle there, and so that was dinner that night. Next one. So finally, we're on our way. This is a very typical stretch. It's a lazy, meandering river with a pretty nice current. It's absolutely lovely float down this river. That gives you an idea of what the shoreline looks like. There's better pictures coming up. Okay, next. And yeah, Mike mentioned the pack canoes, and here's one here. So a pack canoe is a canoe that's sort of a cross between a raft and a tent. And so it's that sort of raft. If you've been on a whitewater raft, it's that sort of material stretched over a aluminum tubing frame, not unlike a modern tent. I got to admit, I was really skeptical of these things, and I remember telling Mike, I've got to see one of these things before I go out on this trip. So he kindly delivered it to my house, and we set it up, and I still went, looks sort of like Lego. But anyway, I am now a firm convert. It did a fantastic job, handled well, lots of freeboard, as you can see there, carried tons of gear, and was, stayed together. I would highly recommend that if you're planning one of these trips and it involves a pack canoe, you do assemble it ahead of time so you know approximately what you're doing. Uh, I haven't touched on the bugs here. The bugs are bad, and it's kind of miserable trying to build these, being swarmed by mosquitoes. So it really helps if you've already done it at least once and kind of know what you're doing. Okay, next. So one of probably the most difficult job we had every day was to find a campsite. This isn't Algonquin or Killarney. There aren't any set campsites. So we're just looking for places on the shoreline that will do. And there's an awful lot of places that won't do. There's a lot of places that you get to that you don't realize. You climb up the bank and you look and there's just no way, it's too thick. But eventually you'll find a place in the spruce trees where they're thin enough that you can wedge some trees in, to wedge some tents in. Sometimes you have to do a bit of gardening, as they say. Okay, next. And there's just another typical example. Next. So I should have meant to show you with the pack canoe picture that there's the shoreline is thick alders that are sometimes tough to get through, and then actually some quite tall spruce trees right at the edge of the river. But that's a thin line, maybe 50 to 100 feet. And then once you bust through that, you're in real muskeg. This is just like walking in a southern bog, except it goes on forever. So it's very hard going. You definitely take boots. We all had good quality. I had bogs, and you need something like that to get around on this terrain. And maybe this is a good time to just sort of talk about a typical day up there. One thing you have to remember is that you're really far north, and so it gets light really soon. And as you probably all know, you can do point counts from half an hour before dawn till, Mike, I can't quite remember, 4 or 5 hours after, but till after dawn, but all in the morning. So we had to get up early, typically 3:30 to 4 a.m. We'd wake up. We all agreed we had to have coffee before we did anything else. So we'd take the time to brew some coffee, but we wouldn't have breakfast. We'd just have power bars. And where we camped usually wasn't where we had to do point counts. So you have to get into the canoe and paddle somewhere, sometimes farther than others. And then from approximately 4:30 to 10 a.m., or give or take, we atlased locating point counts. And that was really our hard work for the day. Then we would paddle back to the campsite, usually catch a few Z's in the tent, get away from the bugs for a while in the tent. We'd have a proper breakfast, and then we'd break camp. Maybe typically by noon we'd be out of camp. We'd stop while paddling to our next campsite for a cold lunch. We never took out stoves and whatnot for lunch. And then probably by about 4, it really depended how far we had to get, and that would range a lot, from 10 kilometers to sometimes close to 40. But around 4 or 5, you need to start looking for a campsite, because truly it might take a couple of hours before you find something that's even remotely suitable. And then we'd make camp, prep dinner, and then we spent quite a bit of time in the evening after dinner planning our next day, looking at what the square we were in had to offer, what our strategy for hitting the point counts. We also did have ARUs, the remote recording units, and we set those out in the evening and then retrieved them in the morning. Those were recording 5 minutes every hour all night to record some of the nocturnal birds up there. And it wasn't hard to get to sleep, usually pretty early, and usually always in full daylight. Okay, next. So that is just an idea of a typical square there. I don't know how well you can see this, but there's little red dots located on either side of the river. And this is the sort of thing. So those dots are the point counts from the previous atlas 20 years ago. And it was a real priority for us to exactly get to those points again. And a lot of the squares, such as this one, didn't have the full complement of 25. This one I think had 14. So we would cover all those. We'd plan how to divide them out amongst the two teams. We always point counted in teams of two, and that it was 14. So then the others we had to create ourselves. So that required some strategizing too. Okay, next. So now we've left the Fawn River, which was slow and meandering, and entered the Severn, which is huge, wide, and with huge sandbars. Its shoreline was even thicker, even denser, went in even further, so and often had a big steep um, sand bank. So we soon realized our best bet was to camp on these gravel bars, which was surprisingly comfortable. Next. So this is another sandbar, and this is a time for me to going to talk about some of the dangers on these trips. We've encountered various things on a variety of these trips. On this particular trip, the most dangerous thing we hit was weather, and that was, as you can see, it was absolutely gorgeous, incredible weather for the canoe trip part of this trip, but the downside was that huge thunderstorms would roll in, and in this particular spot, we were just setting up camp when an enormous thunderstorm rolled in. Huge winds, huge horizontal rain, lightning, thunder everywhere. We just had enough time to get into our tents and literally just hold them down. It's not any point in staking your tent. We just put rocks in the corners. So we were holding our tents in place. Despite that, Alex's tent blew into the river, but we retrieved it. It was crazy for about 15 minutes, and then it settled down a bit. It was still storming, but it settled down enough for me to peer out, and I looked, and there was only one canoe. So that storm had blown one of the canoes out about 500 meters into the river, and there was nothing we could do but get into the other canoe and go retrieve it, because if it floated on down the river, that was the end of our trip. But we did manage to get it, latched onto it, and towed it back, and we only lost, I think, Alex's book and maybe a few other things, so it wasn't too bad. On the Mississauga trip, the very first day, our campsite was visited by a bear, and that bear did considerable damage to our campsite. You leave at 4 o'clock in the morning to do point counts, and so there's not much you can do except leave your campsite there. And but he just didn't do enough damage that we had to call it off. We could patch things together and keep going. River conditions you always have to be aware of, and then of course injury and illness that could strike you any time there. Okay, next.
Ian, I'm gonna need to cut you off in about a minute or so.
Okay, yeah,
So
no problem. Keep going. Just another scene. Keep going. I'll just show. That's just there. We were in Caribou country. You can continue on. Just a few pictures of the beautiful flowers. This is Angus Miles, who was our guide, who met us about 50 kilometers inland from Fort Severn, primarily to be a bear guide, and his grandson, Moses. He just made our stay in Fort Severn. We stayed quite a while in Fort Severn to do point counting and atlasing around the community. Keep going. This is Gonzo birding in Fort Severn. This is where we stayed in the hunt and Angus's hunt camp. This is him doing his job. This is what he was protecting us from. He did not fire at this guy. We just saw him. We took the freighter canoes out there into the Hudson Bay lowlands, where there was a variety of other bird life and very different habitat. Keep going. If anybody's interested, I was going to ask you to guess what the most common bird we saw. It was the spotted sandpiper. I don't think I would have even guessed that, but that's what the record showed. And if anyone wants to guess what that is, it's a short-eared owl. They were fairly numerous. And I was going to just let you have a quick look at the entire list. You can see we did 146 checklists on this trip. We did all our record keeping on the Nature Counts app, which worked wonderfully. It's stored on our phones, and then we uploaded them when we got home. You can keep going. If anybody wants to, I can give you a link to the trip, but it gives you an idea. Lots of yellow rails in the Hudson Bay lowlands. We were pleased to find some baby semi-pals. Good number of shorebirds, mostly at Hudson Bay, but there's some quite on the tundra as well. And I just wanted to outline some of the huge numbers. 349 Tennessee warblers. Savannah sparrows are common up there. Magnolia warblers, huge numbers. Yellow-rumped, orange crowns. And the weather took a terrible turn. It was awful weather while we were in Severn, but for the day we left, it cleared up again and it was beautiful. And sorry, I went on a bit there, but that's it.
That was great. Thanks, Ian. We'll have time for some questions for Ian at the end, but thanks very much for putting that together, Ian.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask, I think up next is Sarah. Okay, next up we've got Sarah Gates, who did the Lower Albany trip last year. So Sarah, take it away.
Thank you. I'm still reeling from Ian's trip because that was similar in your habitat to ours, but you had way different experiences than we do. So it'll be a good kind of contrast. So myself, Sarah Gates, I'm from Toronto, Mark Engel, Kevin Lamb, and Bill Greaves all went on a trip. So two of Mark and Kevin know each other, but the rest of us were all strangers. So that's a whole other dynamic. And I think Ian did a great job of all of the things that Ian did, whether it's pre-planning, all of the gear, all of the conversations being had. You have the same things, especially with strangers. And we did Zooms, so the sarcasm over emails was better understood through face-to-face. So next, we went June 8th to 24th. Good trip. I'm not going to bore you with just how bad the bugs were. We're going to get into a bit of the trip details and then some pictures and maybe some suggestions for if you're thinking of planning your own trip. Three of us left from the Toronto area. We did rent a tow behind trailer. We also had pack canoes in the same that Ian did. And so those were helpful to put in the trailer. Bill came from Ottawa. We met up in Cobalt. We were fortunate to have a family cottage where we stayed overnight. And then from there, we drove up to Hearst. Lovely landmarks along the way, so enjoy the trip. From Hearst, in the same way that Ian was waylaid, we were also waylaid, different reasons, just for bad weather. So we stayed an extra night in Hearst. But from Hearst, we used Turbo Beaver to fly to Fort Albany, the Lower Albany River. Lower Albany River was about 130 kilometers to Fort Albany, which is just maybe 4 kilometers, 6 inside the coast. And then from Fort Albany, we took a commercial flight to Timmins. And then from Timmins, maybe it's because of my birthday, but maybe because we were tired of each other, we all just booked it back to our respective homes. So from Timmins to Toronto and to Ottawa, we made it back in one day. That's a long drive, and we were able to split drivers, so that helped. Next slide. Thanks, Mike. Because we were waylaid in Hearst, we had more time to explore their sewage lagoons and those of the neighboring communities. And just, I think if you're a birder, you probably know to search these out on aerial imagery, but it's circled here in orange what a sewage lagoon might show up as. Yeah. And so we drove there. We had a lot of fun. We got a lot of species. Even getting to that, you can see it's bush, we're seeing stuff. So we had cliff swallows, Bonaparte gulls. That's always fun. And then in there you can see our float plane similar to Ian's, but a bit bigger because we made it in one trip, but just barely actually. We did have to jam everything in there. So that's the 4 of us on the way in. Next slide. So this is the Lower Albany River. Again, we're about 150 kilometers south of the bay. It's wide. So unlike the rivers, this is great contrast. Like unlike Ian's river that he was canoeing on the Severn and the Fawn, or I guess the Fawn, it was quite wide. And so here it's about 900 meters, kind of in and around that range. Great current in the middle. And so our plane flew us in, and at the lower left-hand side is Chipe Island, and that's where we unloaded our gear. The pilot happened to have dropped off people recently to that spot. Lo and behold, when you think you're in the middle of nowhere and no one is around, you might be wrong with that thought, because there is a bunch of federal government rangers, so Army folks or military folks, as well as people from Fort Albany and Saskatchewan were also there, and they're doing a training program like outdoor survival, all sorts of stuff to keep our northern borders safe. And it's a good reminder that you may be approached and ask questions. So have contact information, know what you're doing, know where you're going. We had hard copies of maps, which we provided people, and always just say, it's Mike Burrell, you know, he's our go-to guy. And certainly I think this is another thing, if you're on reserves or First Nation communities, we're all working to have permission to access those lands. There's certainly the atlases, and so just know who those main contacts are. And Mike and the Atlas crew will have provided that to you. Yeah, next slide. So here's a snippet of kind of the paddling conditions. You'll see we wrapped it up a lot. We were so fortunate with the weather when we were paddling. We had a lot of ground to cover in the time that we were there. I think it was about 10 or so days on the river. What we would do is, because the river was so wide, more than 300, 400 meters, we would split shores. And so we would general atlas across every square that we were going through on either side of the shore. And then we would have predetermined locations where we would meet up. Oftentimes that island's in the middle of the river, like you can see in the lower right. The river was so great that our steersman felt comfortable just taking naps. We were always going in one direction, and left Bill and I to paddle. And you see here on top right, you have Bill. He had his food barrel, yeah, the blue thing at the ready. And I had, in the other picture to the left, a bunch of my knickknacks. You know, if we dumped, a bunch of that stuff is getting lost, but for the most part, we had pretty calm conditions. And I have a solar panel charger, a bins, and all other sorts of random things. And as you're just coasting along, like we picked up speed, 9 kilometers an hour was great. And you're, again, general atlasing and checking out all the species. Here's just general overview of like the good campsites. We were fortunate, in contrast again, this is great, Ian. We didn't have to work too hard to find good campsites. Most of them were relatively level and dry. Some you can see had a bit of an angle to them. Because the river is so wide, we would go explore the opposite shore, which was annoying for me because it meant a lot of upstream kind of ferrying to then get across to the other shore. But it builds your muscles and your patience, and we've had lovely locations. Next slide. So that's kind of the trip conditions in a nutshell. Just if you're thinking of doing it, maybe some thoughts that we've learned, and some planning tips. I think Ian alluded to it. Check your gear. We had pack canoes. It's really helpful to know how long it takes to build them. It was about same time frame as Ian, but when the float plane leaves and you have canoes to still build, you want to make sure that they're seaworthy. There's a lot of mapped resources out there. We were exploring different campsites and doing a bit of legwork, the pre-planning, but know that there's more options than just Google Earth. There's topographic maps and all sorts of things. And having a hard copy is handy as well. And then, I mean, like, I'm used to portaging a lot of my gear. This is great because you don't. So this is the remainder of my peanut butter and jam and good old raisin peanuts. So Gorp left over from the trip. So you can just imagine how much I did eat. But because we weren't carrying it anywhere, the only weight limit that I had to be conscientious of was the flight in on the Beaver. So we were good. As far as clothing, there's two different approaches. Actually, should mention three. So Mark and Kevin, they had Gore-Tex pants and boots, and that was really great for when you don't have them and there's a creek and you get to get carried over the creek so you don't get your feet wet. I wear gaiters and hikers usually, and Bill chose to wear inappropriate Crocs, but he stayed safe and dry for the most part because those drained quickly. Duct tape, I found that super handy to have. My soles of my boots came off my boot on a couple of trips, and just making sure that you have those things connected is a huge part of traversing. Windproof gloves with an E-tip. I couldn't believe how awesome these were. Bugs wouldn't penetrate and you can still use, I did a lot of my point counts on my phone. I can do all of them, no problem. And a buff is always great. Next slide. Around camp, easy to assemble bug nets because they also double as shade nets. You see this one, we were having so much fun. It was the only time we used it because it was such a pain to assemble. But there were days where you would come back from your point count and it's 10 o'clock and it's super sunny and there's no reprieve from the sun because in the bush, there's tons of bugs and there's no shade. And so this would have been great. And your tents are saunas. And so easy to assemble bug nets. Add water to your dehydrated meals. If you're planning a meal, put it in put some water in that bag in the canoe and paddle for a while because it's kind of it can be a long wait if you're just adding water at 5 o'clock when you found camp. And I found that Shiraz is great as a wine in the open air, and it's very fun to have a square bash. So when you completed all your point counts in that specific square, celebrate, however that looks to your group. Data tips. I can't think of the exact terminology in nature counts, but if there's like 10 meters or 50 meters and 100 meters, sometimes in the open areas, like you would have seen in Ian's presentation, it's this big open bog. You might be hearing the same bird depending on how close your point counts are. It's nice to see that visually and also report it as data. Stay organized and current. I can't stress that enough. I did not do it. I didn't use the opportunity to do those during my days off. And when I was back at home and having to enter my data, it was a pain in the butt. So just do it at the time during the trip if you're able. And use Avenza is highly recommended, I do. And then you can put your waypoints and reminder to put a waypoint for your boat so you can come back to it after your traverse. Next slide. And then birding, because that's what we're there for. Up to that breeding evidence. Explore, be curious. If a bird flies up from an unusual location, maybe it's on a nest. Go look. It's always fun to find a nest, being respectful of the bird, certainly. Keep binoculars at the ready. I saw, I think it was like 2 or more gyrfalcons, a couple goshawks, but like I didn't have my binoculars, so I couldn't confirm it, and so I didn't report it. So dang it. And enjoy all of the birds. We had a house sparrow up in Fort Albany. That was one of the highlights. And here in Toronto, they are an annoyance. And really just do your best. Palm warblers sound exactly like dark-eyed juncos. And you might get them wrong, and that's okay because they sound the same. Next slide. So keep going. Memorable moments. Bring somebody who knows how to fish, because fresh fish, lightly battered in the middle of nowhere is a real treat. So thank you, Bill. And you're going to bring the appropriate gear. You're up there, you're remote. There's always a silver lining or a rainbow at the end of all of it, and it's a really good reason to build a good bonfire. Thanks again to Bill for building that so quickly, and it boosts spirits, truly does. And then enjoy the habitat specialist species. Forest fire burn. Hey, you might get some cool new birds like the black-backed woodpecker and three-toed. And can you see it in that picture? Just barely, right? Maybe not? No, it's a Connecticut warbler. We tried really hard, 20 minutes, and got annihilated by the bugs, but in the end we found it, and we found two in similar types of habitat. So now I know what to look for, the type of habitat that a Connecticut warbler might be singing in. Anyway, next slide. So here we did about over 100 species, and it depends again on who you ask. I have those deer falcons on my list. The other guys might not. And then we had 17 confirmed breeding. And I think that's just also a note, like you're always going to be divided up in groups. One team might see something different than you. That's going to be life. Next slide. And that's the end. And so that's the four of us. We're still smiling after the end of our trip where we took out in Fort Albany, and the community of Fort Albany, they saw us wandering around. We weren't locals, and they lent us their trucks. They picked our gear up, which we had a lot of, and they just were super awesome. And also humored us by visiting the sewage lagoon with us. So right on Fort Albany. So that's it.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was awesome.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to turn things over now to our final presenters, Andrew Keaveney and Michelle Locke. Take it away, guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. I'll just be doing the same thing. Just I'll say next and off you go. I'll try and make this a bit briefer just because I know we're running low on time. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Andrew Keaveney. This is Michelle Locke next to me, my partner. We're just coming to you from Ottawa tonight, and we're just going to talk very quickly about the North Spirit Lake trip we did with the Atlas this year, June 21st to the 30th. So right at the end of June. Up there, that time of year, it's sort of it's interesting. It's getting towards the end of the breeding season there, so conformations of breeding birds very difficult to get. We had very few sort of passerines that we were able to get sort of conformations and stuff on. But as you'll see, most of the trip sort of centers around the lake and the birds and the organisms that are on North Spirit Lake, which is an absolutely gorgeous place. And this very first photo here is a typical morning, waking up and starting the boat ride on North Spirit Lake towards where our point counts would be. So yeah, absolutely gorgeous that time of the morning. That's probably, I don't know, 4:30 in the morning sort of thing. So, okay, next. These is a cast of characters here. On the left, that's myself taking it easy in the afternoon. We have a lot of downtime for bird watching and iNaturalists. We got Stefan Menu, second from the left, from the Bruce Peninsula Bird Observatory. And on the right, my partner Michelle, and then Martha Miller, who I'd never met before, and neither had Michelle. So she was new to a bunch of us, and she was a great help. She got some beautiful photos of birds later on, you'll see. Next. Oh, great. So this is us. This would be, I guess, Red Lake. Is that right, Michelle? Yeah, Red Lake. So this is kind of how I don't have a big map to show you, but you can sort of visualize this, and I'd love for you to look up where North Spirit Lake is a little bit later in the evening, or you can do it now while you're listening along. We had quite a roundabout way to meet up with each other. Michelle, Stefan, and I we're thinking about driving up, and we finally just decided the heck with that. It's far too, it's too far. It takes too long. Michelle has a full-time job, so we're trying to narrow down time. So we ended up all flying, the three of us, to Thunder Bay, and Martha was on a road trip, so we met up with her, and she drove us, the four of us in her vehicle, up to Red Lake, where we hopped on a plane to North Spirit Lake. Next. Absolutely spectacular views. Other than Stefan, I don't think the three of us had done much work from planes in Northern Ontario before. I have a bit, but it's been quite a few years. Uh, yeah, going back almost to the past Atlas myself, showing my age. But beautiful, beautiful views from the plane looking down. These are mostly, I think, Stefan's photos. He was near one of the windows and got some great photos. We were actually identifying swans and pelicans on the lakes and getting a few anecdotal Atlas records as we were going along. They were big enough and they're big white birds, so we were able to pick them out from the plane. Next. So it was quite interesting. Our Atlas trip was very different than the other two presentations you've seen. In some ways, we were living at large. Uh, Other ways, not so much. But when we arrived in North Spirit Lake, it is a native indigenous community there, and we had to get sort of shepherded off to North Spirit Lake, a couple hundred meters away, in a truck owned by the fish camp where we were headed, which is called North Spirit Lake Lodge. Um, Next. And we took a boat to the north side of the lake. The community was on the south side. Probably only 10, 15-minute boat ride. It's pretty quick and easy. It was a beautiful day when we arrived. We get there, and it was I think we were all pretty gobsmacked as to what this place looked like. We really didn't have a good idea of what the facilities would be like for the week. And they were lovely. We had there was a four-wheel drive vehicle there ready with gentlemen to unpack our luggage for us and and bring it up. Next. This giant boardwalk all the way up to the lodge. So this is typically a fishing lodge. People use it for a variety of things, but it's mostly Americans and their families that come here year after year, um, and often, pretty wealthy Americans, doctors. We met various people coming up from usually the northern states, but from all over the U.S. And there's basically little cabins. I don't know if there's half a dozen or so. So we had an entire cabin to ourselves. Next. Next. And there's our cabin, the big moose antlers. Next. And that's sort of what the interior would look like. So pretty well furnished. Again, very different than than what the other two groups had. So yeah, we had a stove, we had cleaning facilities, washroom, indoor washroom, all that sort of stuff. Despite what the facilities looked like, it was a constant battle with mosquitoes. I don't know. I gave up trying to plug holes. It didn't seem like there were any holes, but there were mosquitoes galore all the time, and I think I spent more time than anybody whacking mosquitoes on the walls. Next. This was the central lodge that you saw earlier at the top of the boardwalk. And this was a place we came at the end of the day. There was actually Wi-Fi here. I see Ian shaking his head. We had Wi-Fi here. We could do our eBird, trip list reports and at the end of the day.
I obviously volunteered for the wrong trip.
Very
Yes, you
different
did.
trip. Yeah. But and this is, we talked to the owners here. They gave us lots of intel early on the first couple days, so we had a better idea as to what this week was going to look like. And one of the things we figured out really quickly by talking to um, the locals that work there and the owners that were not from there, they're from northern Wisconsin or something like that, was that some of the access we'd hoped to get wasn't going to happen, unfortunately. I guess the places that the previous OBBA2 had visited, they'd probably used different means, maybe had motorboats set up at certain locations. Yeah, so we had to sort of change plans and get a new groove pretty quickly. I think we even swapped a square out at one point. Okay, next. So again, pretty nice weather throughout. We were there for about 7 days. We had one day of rain, one day of high winds. But I think we only lost really one day of point counting to weather. Most days it really did look like this beautiful spotty clouds. Uh, the lake was very, very calm. It's a very big lake. I don't know. I want to say 5+ kilometers long, probably longer in some of the points, but yeah, very big lake. We were
I
using
mean, it was 3 atlas squares wide.
three.
30
Oh yeah, okay,
kilometers.
there you go. Okay, much bigger than that. Sorry, 3 atlas squares wide. So there you go. We each so we were partnered up. I was with Michelle, obviously, and Martha and Stefan sort of stayed in the southwest area of Spirit Lake. If you choose to look on a map later, you'll see how different these areas are, bird-wise and just sort of geography-wise. We came across very different types of birds throughout the week. So it was really interesting at the end of every day to compare what we'd been seeing. Uh, there were lots of tiny little islands in Spirit Lake as well, and they served sometimes as breeding colonies for various birds. Our biggest find was a colony of common terns. About 120 common terns came up off of one of the islands that also included a single black tern that we weren't able to find again when we tried to come back for further breeding evidence a few days later. But those terns were, yeah, they were prolific there, and they of course found us before sort of we found them. So next. And again, so most of our atlasing was sort of centered around Spirit Lake itself. We didn't very often go venture too far from the lake. We were in motorboats that the lodge provided, and yeah, basically we're going point to point to point along this boreal um, coastline like this. Next. Sometimes we had to navigate sort of inland waters, and that was quite tricky. But for myself, I had quite a bit of motorboat experience doing expedition guiding the last couple of years, so it was a lot of fun. Sort of having to lift the motorboat engine sort of up or around huge erratics that were at the bottom of these rivers, and just sort of mapping out where all the rocks were on the lake as we were going to. Michelle spent a lot of time doing that. Next. And this is a typical scene when we actually did get on land, what we'd been walking through. A lot of fall down, blow down of course, black spruce is the main tree species there, and lots of sphagnum. Next. So yeah, this is the boat. We had one for each group, so we had two of them. They were fantastic, heavy duty, fast, maneuverable, and they were exactly what we needed for this lake. And of course, that's what the fishermen are using there too. I can't remember what horsepower the engine was, but they were fast. They were faster than the ones the Zodiacs I use for expedition guiding. So they were very good. They got us pretty quickly to our spots first thing in the morning, but still, it probably usually took about what 45 minutes to get to the first point in the morning. So next. Excellent. So these are just a couple of the motorboat driving photos next. There's the other group and taking it easy in the afternoons in that beautiful weather as well. It's really, again, like the conditions were just beautiful for cruising in motorboats. It is really, really good. That last one is again just I think it's an early morning one again. So a lot of these look like the end of the day, but so oftentimes it was hard to tell. We actually did work a little bit. This is a rare photo of myself on one of the small islands in North Spirit Lake looking for ground nesting birds, but most of the time I would be doing the motorboat work, and I'd drop Michelle off, sort of. She'd go off the end, have a look around, and I'd sort of peter off the side of the island somewhere waiting and let her do her thing. But occasionally we'd sort of drop anchor or find something to tie down as well. So lots of spotting from the motorboat as well, which was really easy with those calm waters. And then, of course, point counting, point counting, point counting. Boy, did we ever do a lot of point counting. So beautiful photos from Martha, pair of bald eagles, which were quite common on the lake. Not a ton of pairs, but because they have big territories, but we saw them several every day. this is an incredible, incredible photo. I wish I had more time to tell you about this. This is a photo from Martha when she was with Michelle one day when Stefan was feeling unwell, and they had this bird along one of the rivers, and just it came, from what I understand, that's about as close as the bird was. It was only like a couple
It
meters.
almost jumped in the boat.
It almost jumped in the boat, Michelle says. Yeah, so next. And of course, the ever elusive Philadelphia vireo. Myself as an earbirder is one I'm always looking out for. Uh, and it's always difficult to pinpoint and separate from the more prolific red-eyed vireo. But we did finally get a couple beautiful Phillies. Next, next. So some of the bird nests and eggs we did find very, very little, despite an incredible amount of work. We did find some gull colonies and tern colonies and a few waterfowl nests. So I think I don't want to get that wrong, Michelle. There was ring-billed gulls, herring gulls, common terns. The one with the two eggs in the far right is actually red-breasted merganser nest, the only one, and that's one of those ones Michelle found after being dropped off. And then a used sparrow nest. We figured probably maybe a swamp sparrow or something like that. That's a little herring gull chick. Lots of INAT being done in the afternoons as well. That's a really interesting flower, as it turns out on the left. It's called prickly saxifrage. Very, very few records on INAT if you look it up, and I was told it's sort of like a glacial relic type thing. That is, I probably going to get this one wrong, but it's an alpine. I want to say it's like called taiga alpine or something. Um, but also a very unusual butterfly and very few to maybe almost none INAT records from Ontario. So it's quite unusual. Yeah. In some Labrador tea, it looked like there. So that's the group again. Still happy at the end of the trip. Um, next. And that's a quick look of our trip report from North Spirit Lake. So you can see we put in pretty good coverage. We couldn't really get into that northwest section, which is what we'd hoped to get. There was a square there, but still we probably covered at least 4 squares exceptionally well, and a couple others on the edges of those as well. But again, access very, very difficult if you're not accessing it right from the lake. Very difficult to get into these places. There was a couple opportunities where we had motorboats. The lodge had stowed motorboats at a couple different places, like tiny lakes. That's why you can probably see some different like lakes adjacent. And so we'd walk a couple hundred meters. We'd jump in another motorboat and whatnot. And once or twice, I even had to carry a motorboat engine to a boat that was stowed, and then we'd have to put that engine on and then motorboat from there. So yeah, I had one morning where I did that about 3 different times before we got to the third or fourth lake I was on. So really interesting logistics some days. I think that is it. I hope I kept that brief enough, and thanks again for supporting our efforts up there.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thanks to all four of you. Really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your trips. I think that gives people a much better sense of what they may be getting themselves into. We're a little over time, but we're happy to stick around as long as you guys are. If there's any questions, either for us at the Atlas office about Northern trips or anything Atlas related, but this is your opportunity. You've got some captive previous Northern trippers, so probably best to focus your questions for them if you have any. Do we have anything popping up yet, Kaylin? No?
Nope, nothing in the Q&A yet. Folks can always email the Atlas office if they have any additional questions, and we can always forward them along as long as you guys are comfortable with that as well.
Okay. Well, do we have any announcements we wanted to get out, Kaylin? I can't remember. I mean, the Northern trips is probably the most important thing to announce. If you're interested, if you know you're interested, just put your name into the application form. And like I said, we'll be trying to put some crews together in January. Thanks, Kaylin, for putting that in the chat again. And if you're not quite sure and you want to ask us questions, feel free to reach out to the Atlas office, and if you have something specific you want to ask any of the presenters, we can pass those along to them.
Great.
Okay.
All right. With that, I guess we'll let everyone go. Thanks so much, everyone, for presenting tonight, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thanks for organizing. See you guys.
Okay.